Yeah, let me again actually thank Stan properly for bringing me. We met in Bali at the Ubud Writers Festival, like he mentioned, and I'm just really touched that you wanted to bring me out here to talk about Tibet and to tell our stories so that more people can hear about what happened and what is happening and why it's important that we pay attention. So thank you, Stan and Henny. I wanted to read first from Old Demons, New Deities, which is a collection of Tibetan short stories, the first anthology of modern Tibetan fiction, published in English in the West, and I was lucky enough we got to launch it at the Strand in December, and it was really just sort of a dream come true. So I will read from my story in this collection, and so this short story is called Winter in Patlikul, which is a school in northern India, and it's based actually at my actual school in northern India, and it is about two students, two kids, this girl Hamo and this boy Sherap, and an elderly woman who lives in the school. And this is just a small interlude in the short story. Some things happen, this interlude happens, and then more things happen. So no one knew how old Momo Pasang was, or how she had come to be at Patlikul. Some of the older boys said that she was old already when Patlikul was founded. The other elders were former cooks and dorm mothers and tailors and seamstresses. They were staff at Patlikul or in one of the Tibetan schools. But what was Momo? She seemed to have always been an old woman. The other elders lived in the old people's home by the classroom buildings. Momo, the oldest of them all, lived by herself in a room below the school hall. The other elders were usually fond of students. They sat in the sun, sunning their backs, saying their prayers and chatting, and they often had a smile or a sweet for you when they saw you. Momo never spent any time with the other elders. Whenever you ran into her walking around the school or on her way to the kitchen to pick up her food, she was always alone, muttering what seemed to be curses under her breath. "What's she doing?" Sherap said. She had her cane in one hand, and her other hand was held out for coins, with a small bucket dangling from the wrist. It took us a moment to understand what we were seeing. She was begging. If we had seen her hitch the skirt of her chupa up and start urinating there in the street, we could not have been more shocked. Certainly I'd seen beggars before, in Delhi, in Bangalore, scores and scores of beggars, women, men, children, despairing and dying before one's eyes in the indifferent daylight. My parents, struggling as they were, helped out when they could. My father always gave to beggars missing a body part, such as an arm or a leg. My mother gave to women carrying babies. But Patlikul was a very small town. There were only the local townspeople, and no one was very well off, neither the Indians nor the Tibetans. But no one needed to beg either. And the thing was, I had never seen a Tibetan begging before. Later, I would realize that there were many other things I'd never seen a Tibetan do. I'd never seen a Tibetan bus driver or a honey seller or a milkman, nor a Tibetan artist, a Tibetan actor, a Tibetan scientist. Tibetans were only certain things in this exile of ours. We didn't stay to watch Momo Pasang. We fled and got back to school just in time for lunch. After lunch, we were playing marbles behind the classroom buildings when the kulfi man came by. The teachers said the kulfi man made his kulfi with dirty water from the river, but we didn't care about that. He kept it in a cane basket wrapped tightly with sackcloth. He carried the basket on his head, resting atop a long rope of cloth that he fashioned into a sort of turban. Even in winter, he came to the school to sell his kulfi, even though most of the children who remained for the holidays had no money. "Kulfi, kulfi," said a voice above our heads. An older boy was out on the ledge. he dropped down with an easy swing and held out one tattered rupee note to the Indian. The kulfi man sat his box on the ground and squatted. With one hand, he began unwinding the turban cloth from his head. He looked even sadder and thinner without it. He cut a large slice of the kulfi with his flat steel spatula, wrapped it in a newspaper page which featured a picture of Hema, and passed it to the boy. We watched the boy break the chunk of kulfi in two like a piece of barfi. He popped a piece into his mouth and ate it hastily, as if it were too hot and burning his mouth. Then, carefully making sure we were watching, he licked his fingers. He waited for us to say something. "If you don't eat the rest quickly," Sherab said, "the ink will stain the kulfi." "Oh, really? You know, maybe I got too much kulfi. I wouldn't want it to stain. Maybe I should share." "Maybe not. Maybe I'll just eat it after all." He grinned as if he had made a clever joke, and we laughed. When an older boy thought he was being funny, you laughed along. He folded the newspaper sheet, held it between his teeth, and climbed out onto the windowsill of the first-floor classroom. Rising carefully onto the balls of his feet, he grabbed the ledge and pulled himself up smoothly onto the second floor. He stood up gingerly, dusted his pants, popped the second piece of kulfi into his mouth, and dropped the newspaper. A strip of red paper also fell along with it. We watched the boy climb back inside the classroom. The sheet drifted slowly to the ground and landed. Hema Malini's beautiful face was ruined. Sherab picked up the papers and stuffed them into his pants pocket. After the boy went back inside the classroom, the kulfi man sat and waited for other students, but there were no more buyers. Sherab and I played marbles, watching the kulfi man out of the corner of our eyes. Finally, the kulfi man tapped his wrist, the signal we had been waiting for. We went over, rolled up our sleeves, and held out our wrists to him. He cut 2 small slices of kulfi and placed one on Sherab's wrist and the other on mine. "Ruko," he said. It was a word we knew. Wait. Sherab and I began counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. The slice of kulfi lay like a wedge of orange on the transparent skin of my inner wrist, where thin blue lines crossed like railway tracks. 8, 9, 10. First, the kulfi felt like a sliver of ice on my skin, then of fire. Although the slice weighed nothing, it seemed to grow heavier against my wrist, and I felt a dull pain. The outer edges of the kulfi began to sludge. 15, 16, 17. Sherab's face looked pinched. The kulfi man washed first Sherab, then me. A creamy drop rolled off my wrist. At 21, Sherab broke. I'm done, he said, and quickly gulped his kulfi down. I huffed, relieved. Sherab had lasted longer than usual. Angling my face, I brought my wrist carefully up to my mouth and swallowed the kulfi, feeling the sweet, milky taste spread across my tongue. The kulfi man's face didn't change, but I thought he was satisfied. He began to pack up. We watched him tie the rope-like cloth around his head like a Punjabi's bakri. Then he placed the basket on top. I held my wrist out to the sun. Although we knew the word shukriya, we never said it. There was no need to thank the kulfi man. Whatever impulse it was that motivated him, we knew it was not kindness. So I thought I would just speak briefly about, I thought I would tell you the story of my life and tell you why and how I'm here. So to shift back into history a little bit, in 1949, Chairman Mao sent the People's Liberation Army, so essentially the Chinese army was sent to Tibet to invade and conquer the Tibetan nation. And that entire occupation took about 10 years, and by 1959 it was complete. And the Dalai Lama, the leader of the Tibetan people, who was still a young boy, who was still a young man at that time, left Tibet, fearing for his life. and wanting to carry the cause into exile so that it could live on. So he fled Tibet and came into exile. And of course, after he left, tens of thousands of Tibetans followed him. So my grandparents, my family on both sides lived sort of at opposite ends of Tibet. My mother's family lived near the border with Nepal, and my dad's family was from the other side, closer near the border towards China. And what happened actually was my dad's family at that point, so before the Dalai Lama fled, before a lot of, before the exodus happened, my dad's family decided to go on pilgrimage to India. And they went to India, they went to all the holy places, and they basically were on pilgrimage for a year. And then they were on their way back to go back home when they saw their countrymen just streaming across the border. So they realized, we cannot go back. We have to find a way to stay here and to live here. And my mother's family, because they lived right near the border with Nepal, for people from that region, Kirong, it was actually very easy for them to escape because they could just, it was a day's walk for them to the border, to Nepal. So many of those people from Kirong, from that side, they left, they came to Nepal, and then some of them went back to Kirong to collect more belongings from their homes, to collect family heirlooms and family history and things like that, and came back. But basically what happened was, so my parents and my grandparents lived on the Nepalese highlands. So refugee camps were, hastily set up. International aid organizations were involved. So they lived on the Nepalese highlands for a few years. And then slowly schools for the Tibetan refugee kids were starting to be set up in India. And so they were able to go to those schools. And what happened was, of course, so India, which had previously bordered Tibet, now found itself bordering China. And then China attacked India. So the 1962 war happened, and Nehru, the leader of India, was just really taken aback. And they found we really need to secure that border now. So they wanted to put Indian army there. They wanted, divisions and personnel and camps. But there were no roads along that part of northern India. So it was perfect because they needed roads built, and then there were these thousands of Tibetan refugees who had, in Tibet, they were nomads, they were farmers, but they had left their land behind. They had left their cattle, animals behind. So they couldn't do either of those things in India, and they needed a way to live, they needed a livelihood. So a lot of the Tibetan refugees then were set to work, were given jobs as day laborers, building roads all along northern India. And my grandparents actually ended up working on this long stretch of highway, and then they ended up working on a dam in northern India. It's called the Pando Dam. So that dam, they worked on it for 20 years, and then they built it. I mean, they and a lot of other people. And the dam is still standing. It's still there. When I go to India, I do try to go and see it. The last time, actually, my cousin and I were walking along it, and we wanted to take pictures because our grandparents had built it. And we started to take pictures, and immediately this soldier guy starts walking towards us because dams are sensitive. So they weren't allowing people to take pictures. And then, my cousin said, "Oh, our grandfather built it." And then he was like, "Okay, you guys can take pictures." So we took pictures. So Tibetans were building roads along northern India, and along this particular stretch of road that led up to Ladakh and that led up to northern India, where later the army would go along those roads. What happened was a small daycare was set up, and this was for the road laborers' children to receive, some small basic education. And that day school for the road laborers' kids ended up becoming the Tibetan Children's Village School of Patlikul, where my parents later went to teach, and where I was born, and where I spent the first 10 years of my life. And it was essentially a Tibetan boarding school for kids who, a lot of them had family there, but their parents were, spread all across refugee camps, all across India, many in in the southern settlements. And then there were also many kids whose parents were back in Tibet. So there were orphans and semi-orphan kids there also. And it was basically just a small Tibetan world, a very isolated, insulated Tibetan world in this rural North India, where we lived next to an Indian town but didn't really interact much with them. We just kept, the school was Tibetan, the teachers were Tibetan, the staff, the language we grew up hearing, speaking, the language that we studied in, everything was Tibetan. It was a small Tibetan world. And it was very poor, but it was, I remember it as a happy place, even though there was a river right next to it, which sort of periodically threatened to flood the school, like every few years. And later, actually, a huge flood did come, and then they moved the school, but this was much after my time. So what happened was, I lived there for, that was where I sort of grew up and had my early experiences. And then what happened was the United States government decided to take 1,000 Tibetans from India, 1,000 refugee displaced Tibetans from India, and give them a new life in the United States. So first they were going to, the way it ended up happening was China was going to be offended if they were called refugee Tibetans. So the technical term ended up being displaced Tibetans, and that was okay. So they took 1,000 displaced Tibetans. And of course, so back in the Tibetan refugee communities of India and Nepal, there was a lottery to decide who would get to go. And my mother was among the Tibetans who were selected to go. And my mother decided that she wanted to go because it would be a new life and maybe a better life for us, for her family. So she came to the US first, and then 6 years or so later, we followed. So when I came, actually, I was 14. So when she left, I was 8, and my father was still there, and I had other family. And actually, another important thing happened to me around that time, which was that when I was 8 years old, my brother and I, when we had our winter vacation coming up, we were sent to live with our aunt's family, who lived then in Nepal. And my family was very poor, but my aunt's family had married into money. So she had this building in Kathmandu, in like the center of Kathmandu in Nepal. And she had these shelves full of comic books. Which, from growing up in Patlikul, I had never seen, I didn't really have, there weren't any comic books for children. And there were especially not any Tibetan comic books for kids. So I had never seen so many books in my life. And the other thing about my aunt's house in Kathmandu actually was I had maybe the first culture shock of my life because I was going from this very Tibetan boarding school, which was a Tibetan world, to Kathmandu, Nepal, which was back then extremely cosmopolitan. And my aunt's house, actually, my aunt's house was a multilingual, multicultural experience. They spoke Tibetan, English, and Nepali. And all my cousins, actually, Nepali was basically their, it ended up becoming their mother tongue. That's, that was their primary language. So they communicated to each other in Nepali, and I couldn't understand any of it. So I was just in this place where I didn't really understand the language, the culture, a completely new place, and there were all these comic books. So I would just sit there and look through those books for hours and hours. And comic books, I mean, at that time, I couldn't understand anything. It was Tintin comics, Archie comics, Asterix and Obelisk. I mean, comics all of you would know. And I just started looking through them, and I was able to get the story, even though I didn't know how to read then. But around the end of that winter vacation, I'd made the transition from just looking at the pictures to being able to make out the speech bubbles and to reading some of the writing. And then I came back to school, and it was that first start which really made me a reader. And then as I grew older, I began to, get books from the library. I began to read more. And then there were kids at school who would also, everyone would have, maybe one or two books. And these were all English books, actually, because Tibetan books for kids didn't really exist then. So we were reading later on, Enid Blyton, Famous Five, all the naughty books, a lot of the abridged classics, and then later on, a lot of the Milson Boone, like romance novels and Harlequin romance novels and Barbara Cartland, and I mean, I was reading a lot of trash. But I read enough trash, I consumed enough garbage that I was able to get some nutrients out of it. And I just began to be steeped in language, and I began to love language. And one thing about growing up in exile is that when you're separated from your homeland, you're living in a foreign language, you're living in a foreign culture. And to become really good at language, to have really good command over language, you need the kind of feedback loop. You need to consume enough language in the culture and the literature and the spaces around you. And that's an opportunity that exile and occupation doesn't really afford. But I was able to turn to English, which was my second language, and able to steep myself in it and to grow to have command with English, to grow to have some mastery with English. And then, of course, we moved to the United States, and I went to high school here. And because I knew English very well already, I did well. And when it was time to go to college, I was lucky enough to get into my first choice, which was Harvard. So I went there. And I was explaining to UC Boulder yesterday also, it's just, there are so many majors possible at these liberal arts schools, right? There were like hundreds of majors. So I looked through, and then I decided political science. That's what I'm going to study. Because the problem of Tibet is a political problem. And if I study political science, maybe I can do something useful. I can do something to help. So I started to study political science. And you start off with Athenian democracy and read Thucydides and a ton of old texts. And I realized, you know what? I'm a fan of Athenian democracy, but I do not want to spend days and weeks and months reading about this. And I thought, what do I want to read about? What do I want to study? And I had always loved novels. I'd always loved books. I'd always loved stories and characters. And so that was an easy decision, actually. I shouldn't be in political science. I should be in the English literature department. So that's what I started studying. And what happened around then actually was so I'd been reading, all my life I'd been reading a lot of Western books. And one day I came across a poem that someone I knew had written. It was called When It Rains in Dharamsala by Tenzin Dickie. And it goes, when it rains in Dharamsala, raindrops wear boxing gloves. And it continues to talk about the rain in Dharamsala in such a way that you could see that rain, which is one of the most visceral parts of being in Dharamsala, if any of you have ever been there. And I read it, and it just, I could feel it in my body. I had never, I'd always been a reader, but I'd never thought about being a writer. And that was the moment I thought, maybe I could be a writer. And it was because I knew the rain in Dharamsala, sure, but I also knew Tenzin Dickie, and I knew that he was just like me. And if he could do it, so could I. I'd never read a piece of writing that spoke so much to my experience before. That, and I just, so it made me realize what I could do, and also how meaningful and joyful I might find it. And so I decided, I actually sat down and I worked on a poem. I wrote a poem. And so from then on, I began to write little bits here and there. And so while I was there, I actually had this experience of being asked to interpret for someone who was coming to Brandeis University to give a talk. And her name was Ngawang Sangdol. And I had heard her name before because she was a political prisoner from Tibet. So I agreed to interpret, even though I was very nervous because I'd never interpreted formally in a public forum before. So I went, and before she spoke, I just met with her very briefly to make sure that I had all the proper terms that I would need to interpret. And these were terms like, domkang tupshi, like for solitary confinement, logyu for electric baton, zunsur, former political prisoner, things like that. And Ngawang Sangdol started speaking about her experience. And she was a young woman when she was at Brandeis talking about her experience. She was 13 years old when she was at a protest in Lhasa, in the capital of Tibet, and shouting slogans, "Free Tibet, Free Tibet," and she got arrested. And she spent the next 12 years in prison. So she spent 12 years in prison. And I just realized, it's great that she could be there to tell her story. And also that it's very important that these kinds of stories should be told, because these are stories that the Chinese government doesn't want you to hear. These are stories that the government is, thank you, yeah. Excuse me for a second. All right, so I was able to be a small part of helping her tell her story to the audience that night. And it made me realize how important it is to have a voice and to be able to speak and to be able to express your story, especially when it's stories that are being suppressed, stories that authoritarian governments don't want you to hear, stories that they don't want to be told. So Ngawang Sangdul, I mean, she spent 12 years in prison, right, from the age of 13, but she was actually sentenced to 23 years. She was first sentenced to 3 years, and like, just imagine this, she was a teenager in prison, and she just kept bucking the rules. She didn't listen to her jailers. She sang songs of freedom. She and a bunch of other nuns actually recorded songs in secret about freedom, about independence, about Tibet, about Tibetan people, and they sent them out across the prison. They were able to like smuggle these tapes out with their songs, and so, you know, she did things like that, and then her sentences kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier. So she ended up with a total of 23 years in prison. And what happened was advocacy groups in the US, activist groups all over the world campaigned for her freedom, for her release. And that is why she was released 13 years too early. That is why she was released as a young woman in her 20s instead of, you know, much later in her 30s. So it brought home to me how important a story is. And so after college, I went, by that point I knew that I wanted to write. I wanted to try and translate. I wanted to work on literature, but I wanted some experience also. And I wanted experience with the Tibetan community, with the Tibetan cause, with the political cause. So I went and worked for the Office of Tibet in New York. I was special assistant to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's representative to the Americas, to North and South America. So I worked there for 2.5 years. And during that time, of course, so part of that job means helping to arrange, because the representative is responsible for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's visits to the US. And so it meant helping to arrange those visits and traveling with him and the entourage part of the time. And it just, for me, I'd always been, I'd just grown up as a refugee, and then later, you know, in the diaspora, I had been a Tibetan among 100,000. And that experience taught me, you know, how it seems because His Holiness has this enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders of basically trying to resolve the Tibet issue with the Chinese government, which is one of the most powerful governments in the world. But it made me see that, you know, just existing, just being there, just the fact that he exists, the fact that the Dalai Lama lives and gives talks and tells the people about Tibet. And like that is just the biggest thorn in the Chinese government's side. Like to such an incredible degree, I cannot even tell you. I mean, just recently what happened was, so Mercedes-Benz, that company posted an ad on Instagram, like not even elsewhere, but on Instagram. And they used a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which said, look at situations from all angles and you will become much more open. So they used that quote, and the Chinese government just, they were so angry. They went into like, crazy mode, and of course brought all their rage and anger to bear against Mercedes-Benz, which then decided, we cannot offend China, and they removed that ad. And it was an ad on Instagram, which is, people can't use Instagram in China. Instagram, Facebook, a lot of these platforms are not allowed because the Chinese government wants people to use their own platforms that they can very easily monitor. But the point of this story really for me is, even something small like that, which, it shows how threatened China is. Because otherwise, why would this giant country feel the need to pay so much attention to a small ad on Instagram? It's because they are threatened. So that was, that's sort of what happens. Well, to sort of end up my remarks here, I want to talk to you briefly about my writing and my translation. So after working at the Office of Tibet in New York, I went to do my MFA program in fiction and literary translation at Columbia, and it was while I was there. So I was working first doing translations of the 6th Dalai Lama's poetry, which is about 200 years old, but very simple, very beautiful, very musical in Tibetan. But in translation, it just didn't really work. It sounded clunky and lost so much of its musicality. And then I found this third generation of poets in Tibet so it's this group, and they are doing, they're writing so much poetry, and a lot of it is very contemporary, very absurdist, creative, beautiful. A lot of it about, and it has to be creative to be able to get away with publishing and writing in China, because things are so censored, and it is so easy to get into trouble with your writing. Just yesterday, a Tibetan writer was released. He was set free, and he served, I believe it was 4 years in prison for writing. The government charged him with separatism. So. And because he wrote something. He wrote his thoughts and feelings, and he got sent to prison. So this third generation writers, they function under all the disadvantages of occupation, under those limitations, but they're writing this poetry, and they want it to be read. So I began working on translating that poetry into English, because a lot of the contemporary literature that's produced inside Tibet doesn't get translated, which means oftentimes it cannot, that young Tibetans cannot read it, because young Tibetans inside Tibet grow up with Chinese, and young Tibetans outside grow up with English or other languages. And even though many of these kids, their first language may be Tibetan, their native tongue may be Tibetan, but it is difficult for them to read and write in Tibetan. So So I started doing some of those translations. And because one thing that I realized is because Tibetan is a second-class language inside Tibet, and the Chinese government doesn't want Tibetans to speak Tibet. They would rather they spoke Chinese. They don't want them to read Tibetan. They would rather they read Chinese. And they don't want them to write in Tibetan, which means language is a site of resistance. Literature is a site of resistance. And so translation for me is a site of resistance. And so the other thing that I really, that I wanted to do and ended up being able to do was this book, which is a testament to the ability and the creativity of Tibetan writers inside and outside who now write poetry, who write short stories, who write novels. And I wanted to make sure that I would be able to get writers from both inside and outside because we are all Tibetan writers, whatever language we write in now, because of our political circumstance, whether in Chinese or in English or in Tibetan or in some other language, we're all Tibetan writers. And you know, the Chinese government really, I mean, the Great Firewall of China, like that is a real thing. People have gotten into trouble for communicating sensitive information, and you know, like it's up to the government to decide what is sensitive information. So they don't want connection between inside Tibet and outside Tibet, and I just thought it was really important for these Tibetan writers to be together within the covers of a book, even though we cannot actually be together physically, and we're on, you know, different sides of the Himalayas. And the other thing, the last thing that just was really important to me was, you know, when I was growing up, I mean, it was hard to find cultural reflections, literary reflections of myself, of people like me. Growing up in India with Indian pop culture, with Western pop culture, you know, Tibetan TV shows just didn't exist. Children's books didn't exist. Comics, graphic novels, novels didn't exist. And like it, you know, Stan had read that quote earlier by Junot Diaz about vampires and how they don't have reflections in the mirror. If you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. And I just wanted us to have reflections of ourselves, because a reflection is, I mean, if you look into the mirror and you see something that looks like you, it's something that humanizes you and inspires creativity. So that is what I wanted us to have. And I'm glad that I could be here to share the story with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you'll take some questions. Any questions?
Is your book available in Tibetan?
So right now, it is not. The answer is no. But when I was talking to my publishing house, which is OR Books, literary press in New York City, you know, you have to sign away all the rights to your publisher. But I was adamant that I wanted to keep the Tibetan language rights, because I didn't want, I mean, if it was going to be possible, I didn't want them to have to buy it from OR Books. Like, I can just give that away for free. So I hope that will happen. I don't know yet. Right now, there are, you know, in Tibet, it is very there are books that can be published, and there are many books that cannot be published. The presses are all government, state-sanctioned presses. They are not independent literary presses. But of course, that doesn't mean that there is no underground literature. There's actually a lot of samizdat, because whatever the government pushes down and tries to stop, people will find a way to resist. They will find another way to channelize their writings and their creativity. So when you go to shops in Amdo, or in Tibet, like the shop will have all of these books, and you can see them. And then you talk to the shopkeeper and you ask for another book that was printed underground, and he will go into the back room and get it for you. So I highly doubt that if Old Demons, New Deities, this 21 short stories from Tibet, if it does get translated into Tibet and becomes accessible, I highly doubt it will become accessible through one of the proper publishing houses. But with the underground literature, I'm hopeful.
More questions?
Just one here.
Here we go.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. Is the majority of the population of Tibet now Chinese?
So right now in Tibet, so when I say Tibet, it's Tibet Autonomous Region, and also Tibet has been divided up into other parts of China as well. So other provinces that people would often think of as Chinese, Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu, all of these also, they, like large parts of Tibet, what had been Tibet, have been carved out and into them. So all of Tibet has maybe about 5 million Tibetans. And right now in all of those areas, the Chinese population probably exceeds that, yes. And the thing with the Chinese who come in, many of them, migrant workers who come in is, so Tibet, as we all know, is in the mountains. It's a very high place. The Chinese come there, and then often they find it's too high. The air is too thin. Because the Tibetans have been, we've been living there for thousands of years. Science found that, we had bigger lungs than like other people. Like biologically, we were just designed to be able to live there, because that was our home and we had lived there. And Chinese coming in find, oh, we don't have the Tibetan lungs because this is not our place. But so Chinese will tend to congregate in lower level cities, and the highlands, the more rural areas, those still remain largely the Tibetan areas.
Question here.
I understand that the Chinese are claiming the right to appoint the next Dalai Lama, that there's some controversy about whether there will be another Dalai Lama and whether, if there is, the Chinese are going to be the ones who appoint the Dalai Lama. I wonder if you could just talk about that and explain what that's about.
So the institution of the Dalai Lama, started in the 1600s, and Tibetans are Buddhists. And we believe in reincarnation. So someone dies and then they are reborn, and that is just the nature of samsara and this worldly existence. And so the Tibetan belief with the Dalai Lamas is, one Dalai Lama dies and then he is reborn as another small boy somewhere in Tibet, and he leaves signs, and a search party goes and then looks for him, and they find this boy and they bring him back, and then they train him. They teach him, and they teach him to become, a Buddhist master of dialectics, and they teach all the other sciences and arts, and he becomes fully trained to then become the next leader, political, secular, and religious leader of the Tibetan people. So that's how it's traditionally worked, right? And this Dalai Lama now is the 14th Dalai Lama, so 14 in a long line of the Dalai Lamas. And this is, so it's a very Tibetan and Buddhist system. So, of course, now the Chinese government, which is an atheist government, right, does not believe in reincarnation, is saying we will appoint the next Dalai Lama, which I think, I mean, all Tibetans just find ridiculous. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has said that he will not be, he has said a few things. He has said he doesn't know if he's going to be reborn, that maybe he is the last in the line of Dalai Lamas. He has also said, though, that, you know, maybe he might be reborn as a woman, and the next Dalai Lama will be a woman. And he has said significantly and repeatedly, actually, that if he were to come back, he were to be reborn, he would not be reborn under Chinese control. So, which means he would not be reborn in Chinese-occupied Tibet. He would be reborn outside in exile, in freedom. So it is hard to know what will happen. What we have seen happen with this sort of thing, because the Dalai Lama is, you know, the Tibetan people's leader, but there are other lamas who are also religious leaders and very important figures. And the Panchen Lama, who's also a very important leader and figure. So when he died, what happened was his Tibetan search party went and they found a boy and they recognized him. And then the Chinese government said, we are recognizing this other boy, this is our candidate, this is the Panchen Lama. And they took that other boy and no one has seen him for now over 20 years. So he's just spent his whole life under captivity. And so this other boy that the Communist Party has, and that's weird to think of, right? The Communist Party training a Buddhist leader, but they did it. So this other leader, this boy that they say is the Panchen Lama that they chose. I mean, he goes and he gives talks and teachings, and there's always pressure on people to turn out and turn up and be there. But it is so obviously clear to Tibetans across Tibet and Exile and everywhere that in their hearts and minds, that boy who is disappeared, that's the Panchen Lama. That's the Tibetan choice. And so with the Dalai Lama, we don't know what will happen. Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure the Dalai Lama also hopes very much that the Tibet issue, the problem of Tibet, will be resolved before he dies. I mean, it would be amazing if he were able to go back after spending his entire adult life in exile.
Are there any questions from this side of the room over here? Yep.
Hi. So you said that you kind of communicate with writers in Tibet. How do you find them, and how do you keep their lives safe? I mean, I would think that the Chinese government would want to put them in prison, or how do you contact them and keep their identity kind of masked?
So I communicate very little with Tibetan writers inside Tibet. How I find their writings is often, books and on the internet a lot. So just to give you an example, in this book, I have 21 short stories, 16 different writers, and 5 of them are from inside. So they're from Tibet, or they're from one lives in Beijing, actually. And so a couple of them I just communicate by email, and regular small things like, the story, you know, we're going to publish it, here's what's going to happen. Like, all that stuff is okay. We just have to be careful not to talk about politics, not to talk about the Dalai Lama, not to talk about significant cultural occasions, significant political occasions. I mean, March 10, you know, the National Tibetan Uprising Day, the Dalai Lama's birthday, which is like the main national Tibetan holiday and occasion, like all of those things. So there are many things that we cannot talk about, but there are other things we can talk about.
Okay, one more question. Here we go.
I'm wondering how the Tibetan people in Nepal are treated. When we were there on trek, they seemed to be much more industrious. They knew many languages because of the foreign trekkers. They conversed with everybody. How are they educated? How did they get that way compared to the Nepalese? They were far above them.
So the interesting thing about the Tibetans in Nepal is many of those Tibetans are actually from the Tibetan areas very close to the Nepalese border. So some of them, quite a number of them probably, were able to, I mean, they came into exile and then they were able to go back to their homes and like take out their belongings and come back. So a lot of them had to start with nothing from scratch, but others had some small capital or whatnot to start with. And one of the things that happened with the Tibetans in Nepal was, I mean, they sort of started the carpet industry in Nepal, right? The Tibetan carpet industry in Nepal, which became one of the main industries in Nepal. I think at a time it was probably like, I don't know, maybe 30 or something % of the economy of Nepal. And I mean, I think the thing about, you know, losing everything and then having to start over is it makes you, I mean, it's so painful. It makes you really sad. It also makes you very angry and determined. And it makes you really want to give your children a good life. And so it helps you strive. And yeah, the Tibetans were just very industrious. A lot of them actually, as far as their education is concerned, so they're growing up in Nepal, but they still want their kids to have a Tibetan education, to grow up in a Tibetan culture and environment. So they would often send their kids to the Tibetan boarding schools, the Tibetan refugee boarding schools that had been set up in India. So at my school, there were also kids who had come from Nepal. And, I would also just speak briefly actually about the situation in Nepal right now for the Tibetans. So it used to be easy and great. I mean, there was, you know, the Tibetans had left a country that was being occupied. They had left a country that was being ravaged by the Chinese army, and they had come into exile, and they had found freedom and a new sense of security. But now, these days in Nepal, actually, the situation is quite different, and the Tibetans do operate under a lot of restrictions. And that has really had to do with closer, renewed China-Nepal relations. I mean, China knows that, you know, India is one of the other giants of Asia, right? So China really wants to be the counterweight, and they see Nepal as perhaps a small country that could become a sort of satellite nation. And in recent years, I mean, there's been enormous Chinese money funneled into Nepal, into road building projects, into things like that, which has made the Nepali government and the people, but particularly the government, more and more beholden to the Chinese government. There are even stories of Chinese army coming into Nepalese territory to grab Tibetans to bring them across the border and then detain them. And the Nepalese have been, they've placed like many restrictions on Tibetans inside Nepal now. So a lot of the traditional Tibetan holidays that they used to celebrate publicly and wear Tibetan dresses and things like that, now they often have to do secretly, or it's become much more difficult. And the last time that the Tibetan elections were being held, the Tibetan people in the settlements, they got together and then they voted for the Tibetan president, who is based in Dharamsala, which is the seat of the Exile government. So they put in their votes for whoever they wanted for their preferred candidate. And then the Nepalese army came and took those ballot boxes. They literally just robbed them of their franchise. So things like that have been happening, which is sad. And we'll see. I mean, I don't know what will happen, but I find it heartbreaking that Tibetans came across from Tibet to Nepal to find freedom, and now they're finding their freedom more and more restricted.
Thank you very much, Dickie.